So welcome everyone to our session about how AI will impact the future of methane emission management. My name is David Chan. I'm going to be your host and moderator here today. I'm part of the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, or Amii as it's known as in short. And Amii is a not-for-profit organization that's based right here in Alberta. We were set up roughly 4 years ago as part of the Pan-Canadian AI strategy. And I'm going to just go into this real quick here. In a nutshell, we have a lot of academic AI excellence here in Alberta through decades of research and being at the leading edge there. And what we want to accomplish as an organization, as a not-for-profit, is translate that academic excellence in AI into business opportunities for companies in Alberta. So helping companies understand how you can use AI and ML to make it a competitive driver for your business and really help build up that ecosystem. And as part of those activities, one of the programs that we're running is called Reducing Emissions Through Machine Intelligence. So applying AI and ML for GHG emission reduction opportunities. And that program was made possible through the government of Alberta. And that's what in turn made this panel here possible as well. We're really excited about the opportunities that there are around methane emission management using AI and ML. And so that's why we wanted to bring together the panel here of experts that I'm really excited about having at the table to share their insights with everybody. As far as the agenda for today, so we have about an hour over lunch here from 12 to 1 o'clock. Once I'm done my opening remarks, I'll invite the panelists to provide 5-minute introductions each and provide a bit of context and the foundation for our conversation. Then we'll use roughly 25 minutes where I'll be asking some questions and I'll be getting insights from the panelists. And following that period, there will be 10 to 15 minutes at the end that we'll use for Q&A from any audience questions that come up. And for that, I would ask you to use the Zoom Q&A interface that is available. So if you hover over your Zoom interface, there should be a Q&A in the bottom right. And so as we go through the conversation here today, feel free to pop in questions in there during the conversation, and then we'll tackle them at the end in the last 10 to 15 minutes. If you could use that Q&A interface, that will be really helpful for us, as it'll make sure we won't miss any of the questions, and we can also make sure we triage them and have time for them at the end. And so with that, I'd like to welcome our speakers and panelists that I'm really excited to have at the table here. Jackson Hegland is Executive Director of the Methane Emissions Leadership Alliance and President at Modern West Advisory. And he'll be kicking us off in a minute here. Liz O'Connell is President and co-founder of Arolytics. And David Wares is Sales Director for Western Canada for GHGSat. So welcome to the three of you, and thank you very much for joining us today. Again, I'm not sure if it's noticeable, but I'm really excited about this group of speakers and bringing you together here for the conversation that we're about to have. So without further ado, Jackson, I'll pass it over to you if you want to kick us off with your introduction and opening remarks.
Sure. Thanks a lot, David. Now, this is going to be probably a bit of a challenge for me because I'm rather internet challenged and computer challenged. So let me just see if I can pull up. Can you guys see this?
Yes, I can see your PowerPoint there.
Okay,
and it's just great. Yeah, and now it's in presentation mode. So
okay, great.
Looks good.
Well, David, thanks a lot for having me. It's great. It's really fantastic to have the opportunity to speak with everybody in this space. It's not a space certainly that I'm by any stretch intimate with. So understanding also that it's a critical direction that we're headed in the methane management part of the oil and gas business in particular. So getting to be a part of the dialogue, to communicate to everybody here what we do as an organization and how we can be leveraged for pursuits in this space is a really great opportunity. So thanks again for having us and giving us a chance to speak with everybody. For those of you that don't know us, we are an industry association comprised of about 40 technology and service providers across Canada and the US. We've got great coverage across Canada with representation in almost every province. And I think we have organizations in about 5 states and 3 jurisdictions globally. So we're really well organized to have a set of service providers that can provide solutions within really the 6 primary categories of methane mitigation in the upstream oil and gas sector. Those are listed in those boxes there, or hexagons, I should say, or what are they? Yeah, hexagons there. So, we've been very, very strategic about how we build out our organization. And in every case, we have technologies that are either new and emerging or have been established through innovators in the past, and they continue to evolve their business in a way that that meets the needs of industry and government, primarily to manage methane emissions. And in every single case, what you're finding is that we've got a significant data set that comes out of each of these six components, which ultimately, at the end of the day, we'll keep circling back to in this discussion here today, and the critical importance of that. I just wanted to give a quick overview of one of the primary data collection components that is really bringing a lot of this mitigation activity to the forefront, and this Directive 60 in Alberta specifically. There are methane regulations nationally, there are methane regulations in BC, and there's some nuance to each of them, of course, but primarily these are the categories that are regulated. And so you can see we've organized ourselves in a way that meets all the needs of the regulation. And what's particularly interesting, of course, is that we've just kind of been through the first reporting cycle on this. So the Alberta Energy Regulator and companies themselves are just getting their first view at some of the data coming through. Now, some companies have been doing this for years, so they have a better idea of their data and their inventories and how it will play into things like machine learning, and particularly into maintenance programs, which really is in my view, personal view anyways, is a key place for AI and ML to be playing in the coming time frame here in the sector. And it's really going to be helping to have companies build really strong maintenance programs that will use the intelligence that's available to us. Most specifically, where we're seeing a lot of innovation and a lot of data points coming in is specific to the fugitive emissions, the leak detection, boatloads of data coming in, and David will speak about that, and Liz will speak about how they're managing all the data on behalf of clients, and David's solution, of course, is one that helps identify and execute some of these screenings that are required through the regulation. So I'll kind of leave that part because I've only got about another minute and a half. But there's multiple, it's not just the regulators that are looking for data. There's other folks that are out there poking their heads out, so to speak, looking for data and information. The investor community has their own set of data that they're looking for from producers on their performance around methane mitigation. Funding programs, there's a boatload of funding programs currently out there. They're all going to be collecting different sets of data. Other stakeholders looking for data, whether that's that's anybody that's interested in the ESG performance of an organization. So we've got one of the challenges here that we'll address as a group is, okay, everybody's looking for different information, but some of it's the same. Is there any standards associated with the data we're collecting? And what does that mean for the volume of data out there? And then how it's basically filtered through into the types of platforms that are doing the machine learning in order to build these programs. This is just a cool slide showing, we could talk all day about some of the programs that have gone on, that Arolytics and GHGSat and others of our members have participated in over the course of the last 2 years. So there is a lot of data being collected as we speak, and how that will translate into organizations in the future is something that's really, really exciting in this space. And as I said, here's all of our members. I would suggest everybody here is starting to get a sense of how they're going to play a role into the AI and ML component of this business. So it's very, very exciting, and lots more to learn here for everybody involved, myself in particular. So I'll leave it at that, David, and pass it on to Liz.
Thanks so much, Jackson. thanks for helping set that stage. I think it's really important context for the conversation we're about to have here, so I appreciate that. Liz, with that, I'll pass it to you.
Great, thank you, David. Let me just share my screen here. I'm sorry to disappoint, I don't have any alpaca slides on mine. But okay, so can you hear, or sorry, can you see that okay, David?
I can see that, yeah.
Perfect. Alrighty, so thanks first off for the opportunity to talk here today to the Amii group. And this has been really exciting for us because we were involved as a company in Amii's REMI program over the past year. And we really learned a lot from that and really progressed us on our journey to adopting ML and AI within our organization. And so I can touch on that a little bit, but I'll just give a quick overview of our company, what our products and services are, and how that fits in the overall context of the talk today. So a bit about Arolytics. We formed in 2018. We originated out of one of Canada's largest emissions research groups, and we are technology agnostic. So we recognize that there's not one size fits all solution to emissions management, and we work with our clients to figure out the best fit option for their unique situation. And through that, we've gone to collaborate with a lot of different technology service providers, data types, and different producers along this journey of emissions management. I wanted to quickly start off by introducing the problem and the landscape around emissions management. It's very complex and it's a very multifaceted issue. So there's new ESG pressures, which are really, really mounting in this area. You've probably seen a lot of headlines in the news lately around this. There's, of course, new regulations also adding to that pressure, both federally and also provincially stated currently, and also in the US. It's a difficult business environment due to low commodity prices, but of course that's changing a little bit. There's the data issue, which I'll touch on in a minute here. And there's a lot of new technologies and innovation in this space and increasing cost pressure. So it's a very difficult and multifaceted landscape, as I mentioned. Now, one of the most difficult components of any emissions management program is managing the collection and flow of data, especially when it's coming from different sources. Inconsistent or incomplete data collection and inadequate communication of data amongst different silos of companies. So for example, the operations in the field business unit to the environmental or regulatory unit, that can be a large source of disruption when managing emissions. And now in the context of detecting and quantifying emissions, understanding how we optimize leak detection and considering all of these new and innovative technologies is a complex problem that we are really excited to be working in. So I just have here a few images of different technology options in this space or different categories and how they all interrelate. So in the context of Arolytics, we've created solutions to address some of these pain points. And so we optimize corporate emissions management programs for efficiency reductions and costs in two ways. So first, via our modeling. So AeroFemp is a methane modeling tool to evaluate, design, and support the regulatory approval of alternative leak detection programs, which is essentially any leak detection program that uses new technology outside of just a handheld optical gas imaging camera for detecting leaks. Now, once the program is planned, our data management software AeroVis comes in, and this is used to optimize emissions-related decisions within a centralized platform. So it uniquely aggregates and analyzes data from all different sensors or sources and tries to provide a holistic view of both fugitive and vented emissions for a company. So in the context of AI and ML, our emissions model simulates fugitive and vented emissions and runs different program scenarios to estimate emissions reduction outcomes, work practices for technologies, estimated costs as an example. This is a probabilistic LDAR model, and it's informed by real-world operator and technology data. But future improvements to the model will likely incorporate ML to predict certain inputs, such as leak repair rates or leak production rates, and also such as which sites are most likely to leak. And then prior to the regulatory requirements that Jackson was touching on, there was not too much data actually that was being collected by producers. So it was a little bit more disparate, but since 2020, this has now been mandated. So the actual volumes of data being collected has greatly increased, which has created a much stronger application and potential for ML solutions being adopted with this new incoming data. And then just finally, the software side, AeroViz. In the context of ML, our product really works to pre-process and standardize all the data coming in from these different sensors or solutions, which when building ML models is a really, really critical piece, because that standardization of data will ensure quality and accuracy down the road. And so that's a big factor of what we're doing with our software. I'll touch during the discussion a little bit more on our company's journey through the AI adoption spectrum. I just grabbed this image from the from the Amii website. But over the past year, we've been working closely with Amii through the REMI program to really understand the business case, what is the data required, what is the opportunity, and how we can get this going. But ultimately, when you adopt AI into your company, there needs to be, you need to be solving a specific solution that's addressing a specific business need. So there's been a lot of validation and talking to our clients and understanding really what types of options and what types of data are out there for adopting these types of solutions, and then heading down the spectrum in terms of actual creation and adoption of these models. So maybe I'll pause there. I can talk on this a lot more, but I don't want to take too much of go over too much of my 5 minutes. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Liz. And I feel like we're already touching on lots of pieces that we want to unpack further. So this is great. And David, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And yeah, thank you to you, David, and to Amii for hosting the event. We really also appreciate everyone attending and being given the opportunity to speak on behalf of a technology provider when it comes to methane monitoring. And that's what we do at GHGSat. We're focused on the measurement and the quantification of methane emissions utilizing satellite, aircraft, and analytics. And so we were founded a little over a decade ago with the intention to detect facility level emissions utilizing satellites. And so on Liz's slide earlier, our goal is to move our satellites further on the left of that x-axis there, because there is a lot of different use cases for satellites, but ours are focused on facility level emissions. And so in 2016, we launched our demonstration satellite, and that was just to prove that we could detect emissions utilizing satellites at that level. And so it started with some controlled releases. Then we moved to field trials where we didn't necessarily know if or where emissions were occurring. And there were a lot of lessons learned there. On one side, it was with the technology and how we could fine tune and improve our detection thresholds. And on the other side, it was actually optimizing where and how we looked for certain emissions in different areas. Because when you're looking at the globe, there's lots of places to go. And so from our demonstration satellite, we found that we were able to find these emissions. And our goal now was to move from a development or a demonstration satellite into commercial. And so we launched our first 2 commercial satellites with significant improvements from some of those lessons learned in our early days, to work with industry and find their large leaks quickly. So the goal is putting that methane in the sales line instead of having it vented to the atmosphere. We work in a number of different industries, including power generation, mining, waste management, agriculture, and oil and gas. And we are in the last 12 months have launched 2 commercial satellites, and we'll have another 3 in this upcoming year. And the goal is to have a constellation of 10 satellites in 2 years. So I kind of alluded to it earlier, but our satellites provide a low detection threshold and smaller resolution in terms of where the actual emission occurs compared to other satellites. But the trade-off to that is the revisit rate is going to be lower for a specific location than some other satellites out there. And so there are, by contrast, public satellites, which have a much higher revisit rate. Well, they're actually daily, they're looking at every spot on the Earth, but a higher detection threshold and a resolution of where they can actually find that emission. So in part of our journey, I kind of mentioned there was issues of finding where we would go and look out these facility level emissions. And what we found is by using different instruments, and specifically the publicly available data, we were able to find hotspots, even though the resolution was much coarser, and tip and cue our satellites. And I think the goal here is to find the optimal intersection point for every customer based on a whole bunch of technologies, whether that's public satellite data, our satellite data, aircraft, ground-based technologies, and find something that matches their assets and leak profiles and Liz will ultimately be the expert on talking to this, but doing it so that they can most efficiently deploy resources and get as much methane into the sales line and out of the atmosphere. So I'm not going to touch too much on aircraft today, but just an opportunity where we were able to manipulate how the instrument works a little bit and fly projects for different customers, because there is a definite business need to fly project specific as we continue to launch more satellites. So anyway, I look forward to the discussion with everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, David. And yeah, I'll welcome Jackson and Liz back into things here. So thanks for helping set that stage. And what's interesting to me is, that I think Jackson and Liz and David, you all touched on different technologies that come into play here when it comes to methane emission management. And I believe I heard somewhere that up until recently, sensors that were developed or technologies that were developed in the 70s were still the state of the art for methane emission monitoring and management as well. So I'm curious, can you comment a bit more on some of the new technologies that are up and coming, in addition to what we already touched on, and how that is changing the field and how things are being done?
Sure, I guess maybe I could start. So there's quite a few, and it's a combination of both the application of the technology, meaning whether it's fence mounted, whether it's mobile to move onto the site, whether it's truck mounted, sensors that are used to drive around sites in our sector, whether it's drones, handheld devices, fixed wing satellites. David touched on a few of them that GHGSat's active in, and how this relates to Liz, of course, is that their program is looking to ensure that it can capture all of these different sources into the system. And so there's that component, there's the application component, but then there's also different sensors. And this is where we start getting into some really neat technology and some really innovative folks that are able to bring forward different sensors with they bring certain challenges, of course, and also over time, they ultimately will be some of the major technology improvements in this space. So that's a really high level view on it. There's certainly individuals out there that can speak very specifically to the different types of sensors and how they're applied. But as you can see, is similar to the evolution that GHGSat went to, is every single one of these technologies needs to go through that evolution of starting small and getting small bits of data, and then working on getting bigger and bigger data sets. And then behind that, of course, you've got to work on your data management system. And so there is this evolution, not just of the technology itself, but of the data management system behind it. And so then now you've also got technologies that are being developed in this space around through the communications world. So can we apply some of the technology that's being used in standard communications to better have these data points communicate with one another? So there's multiple layers now that we're seeing of this technology development that's very, very interesting. And we're very fortunate in Canada right now to have a lot of dollars going into the development of each of these different types of technologies. There's programs that have been running in Alberta now for the last 2.5 years that are testing out some of these technologies, the fence mounted, the trucks and the drones and the airplanes and satellites. And they continue to go on today. There's one going on in the Sundre area right now. There was one in the Rocky Mountain area a couple of years ago. And so each of those are collecting higher volumes of data to see which of these technologies can get through this initial sort of testing and help them improve. And then, like I said, it will be incredibly interesting to see where the communications, can we use Wi-Fi? Can we use current, infrastructure that's already in place without having to build new infrastructure for all of the data to be moving where it needs to move? So it's a very intriguing space right now.
Yeah, and to jump on what Jackson was just introducing there, you can think of all these technologies almost on a sliding scale of detection limit versus how fast or what the frequency of detection is. And so we have fixed sensors on one end. They might be taking continuous data in, maybe a data point every hour or even more frequently. And then we have things like satellites and aerial that is a little bit less frequent. They might be doing monthly scans, biannual scans, for instance, and that's really, really effective at getting this top-down look of where the greatest emitting sites are and focusing your efforts on those lowest hanging fruit. There's been a ton of research in this area that's found that a small percent of sites, maybe 20% of the sites on an operator's asset field is responsible for maybe 80% or so of the emissions. So those screening technologies are really, really effective. But when we think about all the data outputs from those different technologies, there's a lot of differences and absolutely no standardization. So when we're trying to answer ML type questions and build these ML models, for example, for predictive capability, understanding, like say if the ML question was, what is the probability that this site will leak in this given time frame? Well, you'll need to have consistency around what scale of data that's coming from. Is that being collected at the component level, the equipment level, the facility level, or the site level? And all those different technologies collect data at different scales, often within an oil and gas site. So some kind of consistency and standardization there will be really important. And also on the temporal scale, if you're only collecting a few data points a year with these high-level screening technologies, it'll be difficult to really have the level of data required to start training these ML models to get those level of predictions. So that's really sometimes an advantage of more of that continuous data, is to be able to build out predictions on a bit more of that defined time intervals. But anyway, each technology has its own definitely unique case and unique fit within this landscape. So it's definitely an emerging area, and it's really exciting to be part of.
For sure, and I think you made a comment earlier. There's no silver bullet. If someone comes to you and says that their offering is the be all and end all, I'd ask a lot of questions about that. And I think it's finding the right amount of investment of resources based on your assets and what you see in terms of what the best fit may be. And I think the benefit of using dispersed sources and different sources with different detection thresholds and revisit frequencies is you can kind of balance the pros and the cons of each. And I think one thing we have our own satellites, yet we decided it was valuable to go and get coarser resolution data because of the higher revisit frequency. And I think a lot of the conversations we have with operators, it's what are we going to do to make sure we don't have anything happen between our two ground-based surveys? There is a blind spot there. If on day 2 you have a leak after your OGI visit, there's something there. So you can have some backstop or some other information inform your decision making, just to ensure that you're doing the absolute best you can. Because we know there's lots of pressure these days from all sides in terms of ensuring we continue to be the best industry in the world here in Canada. So.
And so that's really interesting to me that you mentioned the data and sort of how the different technologies are complementary to each other. Is that something that you're seeing today, or is that how companies are thinking about emissions management? Are they bringing together different data sources and typically employing multiple technologies?
Yeah, I think that's the direction industry is trending, absolutely. But keep in mind that these are brand new requirements. These only came into effect in 2020. So I think there's a little bit of time required to get industry to even adopt this new culture of actually detecting leaks. There's really kind of the gold standard right now is this handheld camera that looks like it's from the 70s. And that's what most producers, the business as usual approach really for detecting leaks. It's more of a qualitative approach. It doesn't do the best job at actually giving you an emissions rate, but it can really tell you that binary yes, no, is there a detection here? So that's really what's being quite standardized, I guess, across industry. That's very common. I think more and more we'll start to see industry adopt all these new technologies as they learn of the great both data pros that come with it. You're able to get top-down data, bottom-up data. You're able to actually quantify and get real emissions rates. And you're also able to differentiate vents from fugitives nicely. And also there's great cost savings potential too, because that's a really labor intensive way of detecting leaks. And so with all this remote sensing, you're able to really drive down costs. And I think that's probably going to be one of the main drivers to all this adoption.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly a spectrum of operators out there and what they're trying. There's some who are going to do exactly as the regulation says, no more, no less. And there's some who are going to go try every single technology and make their own assessment of it. And then there's everyone kind of in the middle. And so it really does depend. And I think it's very important in all these discussions we have with our clients of figuring out where they're at today and where they want to get. Because there's a lot of ways to get there, and there are certain technologies that certainly fit, and others that might not be may not mix. So.
Something that's important to remember is the regulator has as much interest in all this information and data and evolution of technology as anyone, because it helps them improve their regulations. And their goal is not to put more cost on industry. Their goal is to have a sound regulation that meets the objectives of the government. And so, they are as keen as anyone to understand where these technologies are moving, and then evaluate the data and understand how they might make adjustments to their regulations. So what's really great about this space is that everybody really is pulling the same rope. We all want to find the lowest cost solution, and we know that technology is going to be the solution. And as Liz mentioned, the regulator has a brand new data set. The reports just came in the last few months into the regulator and to the companies. So running through evaluations to then determine whether or not they want to be investing some resources, time and money into understanding these emerging leak detection technologies, or investing in other mitigation technologies on site. It's very fresh. And there's trepidation because there's always potential changes to regulations, and now we have another election coming that might incent some changes. It's moving parts, but ultimately what's going to ground everybody is improvements in the quality of data. And the more efficiently we can get that information, then everybody can more quickly act in the case that there's a change in regulation or government.
Yeah, and it's actually an interesting point there. I think with, in my past life, someone mentioned to me, they're trying to figure out whether they're competing against the guy across the street or the guy across the ocean. And I think in general, a lot of what the regulators are trying to do is continue to show that what they are doing is working well. And I think something interesting about maybe the higher detection threshold, but the revisit rate, or things that can go globally, is we can have a fairly good apples to apples comparison of what leak rates are like in different parts of the world. And I think that there's something to be said for continuing to toot our own horn about how well our regulations work and how much focus the operators put into this space.
So as you mentioned, there's the new regulations that came in. There's clearly new technologies and a lot of new data coming online as well. And so that then, of course, is that foundational piece, is that requirement that you need to have in place in order to actually do really interesting things with it, such as applying AI and ML to that data and deriving new insights. So Liz, maybe I'll start with you on this one. So given that there's lots of new data coming online and new opportunities present itself, so, how does Arolytics think about how AI and ML tie into that, and what you can do potentially with all this new data that's coming online?
Sure, no, definitely. And it's absolutely an emerging area, and I think one that's really exciting. And I think when Arolytics, when we're considering AI within our organization, we've built opportunity maps. And so trying to come up with a question that ML can answer specifically, and validating that, as I mentioned, with our clients, and not getting too far down the road, and really understanding what data, what inputs are required, what is the question answering, what are the outcomes, and even more importantly, how will our clients actually act on these outcomes? So we can do all these fancy predictions and try and build these ML models, but ultimately our clients at a stage that they're ready to act on that. So the idea of predictive maintenance is a really good one. I think there's a ton of potential in that area. For us, I think there's definitely still a gap around the quantity of data and just really both the speed and the velocity at which the data is coming in, and also just the sheer magnitude. Do we have enough to build accurate ML models? Because there's a lot of risk if we start trying to make these predictions. If we're trying to understand or predict what sites, for instance, might be emitting, or where there's going to be failures, we need to have a pretty high level of confidence with that, I think, and that can really lead to a lot of disruption within a company if there isn't that level of confidence and accuracy in those predictions. And so building more data will really support with that. Some of the questions we've considered through kind of our journey in adopting ML is like, what is the business problem that we're addressing? Do we have the level of supporting data and the actual fields and the consistency? What is the value and like, what's the feasibility? So we actually just hired a new software developer that has a background in ML. And I think that's obviously, one of the first steps, making sure that you have the internal expertise as well to start implementing these. So there's just a lot of different considerations for us as we kind of go down this, but really we've started with, I think, the ideas of projections, predictions, probabilities. Those are probably the broader spectrums that we're looking in right now, and trying to build into our product roadmap based on the data that's coming to our platform. What type of questions can we start to answer? And we're not there yet. We don't have everything set in stone. I think it's just this constant kind of iteration of taking the data in, understanding what it means, and trying to really validate with our clients where the value is. So it's definitely an ongoing area of work for us, but really excited, and Amii has definitely helped us along that journey so far.
Yeah, and I think it's more data isn't always better. I think what's the business purpose, and kind of just maybe a cautionary tale. I mentioned there's these publicly available satellite data, and for us, we used it as an excellent opportunity to start to figure out where we can tip and cue our satellites. But someone else saw a business opportunity there of using it for global transparency of methane emissions and naming and shaming where they see or find different emissions. And so it's a hot button issue, and people like putting it out in the news. And there was one example where an emission was detected. It was a planned event, but the release rate was large, even though it was for a short period of time. And so, doing some math and some interpolation, they determined the size of it and the location of it. And it turned out that it was a short-term planned event. Very little methane was released, and the predicted area was 30 kilometers away. And so, I'll put that all together. It's a pretty scary thing where you now have, in the radius of 30 kilometers, there's a lot of given operators, but you can raise a flag and really smear an industry if you're not using this, with the correct understanding of some of this data. And so I think, it's really important to understand the data you're using and have a business purpose and have that expertise to be able to work with it.
So I'm glad you brought that up, David. I saw that article in the New York Times, and it certainly got some attention. We were getting calls from companies out of the US as soon as that article came out. And so it is very interesting, and I do appreciate the cautionary tale around it. Something that comes directly from that's very interesting, and I'm certain David and Liz are both working on this and understanding it in the ways they need to, but is data ownership. This actually might be a challenge to broad-based application of machine learning in the sector, because if data ownership becomes a significant barrier, we need to all figure it out together, how to get through that component. Because to David's point, the sector is saying, listen, we're going to be cautious about which data we want released, because it can be interpreted in multiple different ways if it gets in the wrong hands. And we also don't want the regulator to come knocking on our door if they're getting information released that we don't approve of them getting released, and now maybe we get a non-compliance issue. So and certainly, Liz, they need to manage their business in a way where they've got their clients' data, and there's an ownership piece to it. So everybody along the way, there's a data ownership piece that needs to get solved. It will be an ongoing issue, but in any funding initiative that's out there and any reporting that goes out, there's a data ownership piece, and it's just something to keep in mind as we move through this.
I do want to spend a bit more time on this, but just as a heads up for time, I will prompt the audience. If you have any questions, do pop them in to the Q&A field, because we'll be able to get to that in a few minutes here. But David, specifically, I'm curious, more data is not always better, but I do recognize that I believe, as GHGSat operating these satellites, you do have access to a significant amount of data. And what are some of the applications that you see there with AI and ML for that? Is Is it just detecting large emissions, or are there other opportunities for leveraging AI and ML on the data that you're collecting?
Well, I mean, down to kind of our internal processes, one of the biggest gains, and it actually could turn into a cautionary tale as well, is we're processing all of these images, and we have millions and millions of pixels and hundreds of observations, and you need to process that. And it goes back to the Chihuahua or blueberry muffin. A methane plume can look like a methane plume, or it could be some sort of albedo or artifact effect. And so at times, we've had to continue to refine these algorithms, because otherwise you start to run into these false positives. And something that a trained eye can look at and determine based on some of these patterns takes machine learning some time. And so, I think for sure it's just accelerating how quickly we can take these different observations in, process them, and get the client the information they need to decide to act or not act based on our findings. And so I think without a doubt, that's the primary finding we see. I mean, there's kind of these, I alluded to that cautionary tale. I mean, that of the publicly available satellite data and kind of attributing emissions where they may or may not be. I mean, that's turned into a product for us. Now we can comb through this data and show what looks like an emission. So at least if an operator gets a call from the New York Times, they know to assess what was shown, where it's coming from, and what they can do about it. Because owning that dialogue, I think, could be quite important versus getting a call saying something occurred wherever and determining what your next step is versus kind of being proactive and being aware that that's out there. So I guess two ways in which we're using it right now.
And beyond that, I'm curious in terms of what applications you're seeing as well. You mentioned that might actually turn into a product for you for GHGSat. Jackson and Liz, from your experience in the industry, what other applications are companies using AI and ML for in this space? Is it primarily just for leak detection, or are there other sort of fun applications that you're seeing there?
Yeah, no, definitely. So there's numerous and there's countless applications for sure. I'm most familiar with the ones that are closest to the area we operate in, but I've seen some other really cool examples. We're talking with a company. They're more on the combustion side of things. So they do more emissions mitigation, and they've been working on how can they build in ML to improve optimization for process burner control. And so it's not just about emissions leak detection. There's areas to integrate ML into all aspects of the detection, the mitigation, the planning, the forecasting, all aspects of emissions management. So I think it's, again, as more and more, as this data starts to grow, and another big consideration too is not just the quantity, but the historic nature of that data. So if we're trying to make predictions too over many, in 6 months or based on the time series, it's difficult when you just have 1 year of data too. So that's another big consideration. And I know a lot of different tech companies in the space are actively working on this across all, a bunch of Mila members as well. Jackson can probably talk to that a little bit better, but it's definitely an active space.
Yeah, I mean, it was well said, Liz. All I can say is you're absolutely right. I mean, every one of our members is aware that this is an emerging space. I think you can broadly position it as anything related to energy efficiency and energy consumption as a whole for our sector, because it leads to efficiencies and cost savings ultimately. So there'll be some interest in sort of every one of those pieces that Liz addressed, and consequently, that relates to many of our members for sure.
Okay. So we can move into audience questions. So if there are any other questions, please pop them in there. I noticed there was one about the recording. So that one's been answered, but if there are any other questions, please pop them into the Q&A field. I'm curious, thinking about the future a bit more, where we just are starting down this journey. We see huge potential for ML and AI in terms of what it can do, as you just mentioned, Jackson, broad implications. But what are some of the challenges? What are some of the roadblocks here potentially, or what are that you see kind of as crucial that need to be overcome over the next few years to really let this have the potential, let AI and ML have the impact that it has the potential to.
Access to data, data ownership, and infrastructure, I guess would be my three components. We addressed kind of really all of them along the way. I think the infrastructure piece will be a really interesting one. How does it integrate, you know, all these new data points? How will they integrate with some of the existing data infrastructure, the SCADA systems, et cetera, that already exist on site? You know, it will be, I don't know if that will actually be a barrier or not, to be honest with you. I guess another potential too is human resources and expertise, and hopefully, you know, organizations like yours and everybody else that's involved with trying to shepherd this along and ensures that there's appropriate training that goes out, because as we've said, data analytics and interpretation can be problematic if you don't have folks with the appropriate background and experience. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me, but perhaps I'm certain there's others out there.
Just on the ownership piece, I think it does get quite interesting once you move outside the fence line of someone's facility. Who owns that data? And it's certainly an active conversation we're having with a number of different clients, and it's important. I mean, if you take an observation from a satellite of the 12-kilometer area, well, there's more than one operator in there. So, you know, how do you distribute that? How do you, you know, who owns it is quite an active discussion. I'd also, you know, echo one thing for us. It's we always need more servers. There's a cost implication with more and more data, more and more servers, and the human resources piece is huge too. Getting the qualified people who actually can help on the back end with a lot of this stuff that's going to be well out of my realm of expertise.
Yeah, I think one of the, like, in addition to all those challenges, another challenge might be taking the outputs of these models, you know, MI and AI and ML, and actually making them actionable. So it's one thing to show data, but to actually understand it and to actually have it change your business process or how you work day to day, that's a learning curve. And that will take a little bit of maybe a culture shift, or it's one thing to, yeah, just present it on a dashboard. You know, we expect this, we predict this piece of equipment might fail next month, but understanding, you know, the accuracy around that and how you really learn from that, it will take some time, I think. Yeah, you know, there's nothing stopping people from building inaccurate ML models, but I think really the challenge is understanding, like, what level of input and data do you really require to get that level of confidence in your outputs? Because there's a lot of risks, as I mentioned, associated with that. And so I think that'll just continue to grow and get better and better. You can always test with synthetic data sets and stuff too to get off the ground and start to build in that way. So that's potentially one opportunity to address some of those challenges.
I mean, I love that, Liz, because it comes down to really something we all know about in our personal and professional lives is trust. And trust in the system and trust in the outputs is going to be so critical, because if it fails at any point, if an algorithm or a system fails to provide the correct information and it was costly in some manner, then that is a significant setback to this being accepted and applied. And as Liz mentioned, it can be a long uptake for the producers of the world to say, I have enough confidence and trust in this to make decisions based off of it, particularly when you've got, you know, operators in the field that have been working a certain way for decades. And you know, that will be very interesting to see how that evolves. I mean, a good example is whatever it was, probably 14 years ago, I spoke to some operators when I was working for a producer in town, and I told them we had to measure air because we put in an instrument air system and we're going to generate carbon offset credits. So the only way we can do it is if we measure air. I don't know how long it took to get it through, to put the air meter in, and how many iterations we went through, how many people I had to talk to, and how much convincing had to happen, because they're like, why in the world would we measure air? Like, are you kidding me? So, you know, we're going to see some similar things like that, where we're looking at multiple data points into a system that's already been established for a long time.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And absolutely, I think glad that you flagged that as a challenge, because we have seen that where systems have been built, right? But then if the trust is not there, then the system's not going to do much good because it's never going to be adopted, really. You also alluded to the talent side of things, and there is a question here that popped up that touches on that as well, and maybe the group can try to tackle this one. What skills would future engineers, young professionals who are trying to get into the ML AI space within the emissions industry need to have? How do beginners get into this area?
Yeah, good question. I can touch on that maybe just from our hiring perspective. I mentioned we just onboarded a software developer that has a lot of experience in developing ML algorithms, more on the cybersecurity application, but this is certainly the foundation that you can be applicable to a lot of things. So through the REMI program, we actually touched on this quite a bit, and understanding what types of talent we need to adopt within our organizations to have the capabilities to start implementing this. And it touches so many different areas like data science, DevOps, back end, but full stack, and even broader than that. And also you need to have the subject matter expertise or the product lead to really guide the development and the direction of that too. I know there's a lot of, Amii could be a perfect example of a resource to start understanding the foundations of this area. Our software developer learned this in school. I think a lot of universities are starting to have these types of programs as a standard because it is really a growing space. So that's another opportunity.
Yeah, and I'm not certainly not an expert on that area, but I think one thing I've found in my time here is that the people who are the largest contributors typically take a serious interest in the business and what the end output is. I think there's those who just want to, who want to code, and there's those who want to actually dig into the details of what the output is. And I think when they take the time to understand the business, it really does help them. So anyway, I'll just add that piece.
And there's probably I say this, being rather naive to the type of expertise that's required for the AI and ML side. But if you really want to just get started, the quote unquote mailroom type of work that can be done would be just understanding getting an understanding of the data and the type of analytics that's happening today for project decisions. So that's being whether you're an emissions analyst, whether you're regulatory reporting compliance person, you're going to have a view towards the data, and you'll start to get a good understanding of the information that's being collected from a regulatory standpoint, and slowly you'll start to get exposure to the multiple different data points that exist even outside of regulation, because project decisions are made oftentimes outside of just the regulatory information that you collect. So you can get in, even if your expertise is in coding and very technical in that regard, but if you were able to take some time to understand the emissions management side of the oil and gas sector, then that would probably be helpful in how you move forward in this space.
Yeah, those are good points, and I think David and Jackson, as both of you allude to, right? Like the domain knowledge is really invaluable, right? And so building that up and starting to understand the area, even if you have a really strong ML background already, it's just going to benefit you down the road. So that absolutely resonates with me. Maybe one more really quick question before we wrap things up here. Data came up a lot as a prerequisite, and more data is not always better. But I'm curious, do you have any advice for companies that want to get into this space, but they're lacking data right now? So, what any ideas or suggestions for how can you get started with data, with some of this AI and ML for emissions management if you're not sitting on a pile of data that can help you out?
I would spend some time understanding the public sources of data that exist, and there are multiple. And just work with that. It's maybe not so simple. I don't totally know yet. I'd need to get my head around it a little more. But there are public data sets that exist out there related to that are used for emissions quantification, and you'd want to understand the different types of quantification tools, methodologies that are out there, and then look to work through the public data set and the different methodologies that exist, and see how you might be able to apply that into this space.
Yeah, and to build on that, a great way to get started is just through synthetic data sets. And that helps validate some of your expectations around the outputs of the model when you're quite confident on the inputs and you can play around in that regard. So there's really nothing stopping you from getting going and start building some of this work and just testing it with fake data sets and go from there. And also, yeah, great idea to leverage some of the public data because there's tons out there, as Jackson mentioned.
One resource I'd point people to that we've put out is Prism, and it's Pulse, and Pulse is a free web-based tool that provides aggregated global data, and it's at pulse.ghgsat.com, and it's really just intended to start the conversation of what different methane concentrations are. But I mean, there's all sorts of free data available, and I think if you're just focused on what business problem you're trying to solve, I think that'll point you in the right directions of where you can access more data and kind of start the journey. There's a lot out there. So
awesome. I do realize we have one more question from the audience that I don't think we'll be able to get to it, so we'll follow up offline with you, Mark. But I want to make sure we wrap things up on time here. And so with that, I just want to take one more minute to thank everyone again for joining us, both by the audience members, but also our panelists. Thank you very much for joining us and lending us your insights in this area. I find it a super fascinating area, and so I really appreciate having the opportunity to get into this discussion and learn from you all. There is huge potential here, so any audience member that have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Amii. We'd be happy to kind of engage in further discussions. And as we alluded to a couple of times, the panel was made possible through the Reducing Emissions through Machine Intelligence program, and that is accepting applications right now and looking to get started in October. So if you have any follow-up questions for the program, if you're intrigued about what the opportunities are around methane emission reduction using AI, ML, and data, please reach out to us as we'd be happy to have further conversations and dig into the details with you. So with that, I believe right on time, I'm going to get us all out of the panel on time. Thank you again to everyone for participating, and especially Jackson, Liz, and David for lending us your insights. So we can't do a round of applause, of course, in a virtual setting as we've learned, but thank you so much again for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity. That was fun.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.